Okay, I'm down. We have to have a reckoning in this country about what happened in Iraq, because we're doing it again. I mean, the same neocons or their emotional, psychological, and spiritual errors are about the work of Russia, creating a war with Russia, pivoting from Russia, attacking China. They're even putting a time clock on it now. 3 years from now, we're going to go after China. How stupid is this? I mean, if this was a B movie, people would walk out halfway through. But unfortunately, this is the government of the United States, and it's moving forward for more war, more conflict. And it's about time that they were exposed as a bunch of fakers and charlatans who have taken this country down a path that is very dangerous, that could lead to World War III, which, there's not going to be anything left. So I think this review of Iraq 20 years later is not just about Iraq. It's about America's role in the world. It's about whether or not we agree with an American imperium, whether we agree with a unipolar world, whether we want to accept that we are a nation among nations, or we have this fantasy of being a nation above nations. If we try to maintain that fantasy, we won't survive.
The one of the things I think you have to look at is it's the same people over and over again who are doing these wars. How we can put Ukraine into a separate compartment or a separate box than these other wars, when it is fundamentally the same foreign policy and military leadership that created and sustained in those wars for decades. And particularly too, when you look, I think, at the trajectory of American warfare, particularly starting in the second half of the Obama administration, the desire to use proxies, the desire not to have the political cost of American casualties. I think once you have that, remember the Afghan war is tremendously unpopular. Obama in his first term puts himself out there, goes to West Point, makes a big speech, sends 70,000 more soldiers to Afghanistan. This is his chance to show that the world that he's a better commander in chief than Bush. They can win the right war, on and on and on. And the thing that I believe doesn't make the Afghan war a political cost to the White House in 2012 or 2010 is the fact that 10 million Americans were in the process of losing their homes. But starting in that second Obama administration, you start to see a real shift in how the Americans fight their wars. The idea that you're going to use proxies, or you're going to use contractors, you're going to use special operations or CIA or drones, all these secret types of things that you can't talk about. The American government can't even talk about if they want to. So those types of things, I think, are some of the legacy, and you see that very clearly in the Ukraine war, which is a proxy war being conducted by the very same people that were in power and put into motion and sustained these wars for these last decades.
What do both of you say to the argument that no, in this case, the U.S. is Russia because the U.S. invaded Iraq and Russia invaded Ukraine? I've heard that argument a lot. So how do you guys respond to that?
When one understands the recent history of Ukraine, where Ukrainians had elected their president, who was then overthrown by the United States in 2014. And when that happened, the United States provided money for Ukraine to mobilize their army to attack eastern Ukraine, which was Russian-speaking. And they exacted about 14,000 casualties, actually deaths of Ukrainians who happen to be Russian-speaking. That story never gets told, because the establishment practice in America has been to put Russia on the back foot through NATO and through the United States State Department and the Department of Defense, put Russia on the back foot, keep Russia occupied in Ukraine, use Ukraine. The Ukrainians are being used as pawns. I represented a very large Ukrainian community as a member of the United States Congress and supported them. I went to Ukraine and met with President Kuchma and journalists who were telling me about Kuchma's role in the murder of a journalist, okay, and stood with protesters in the square when the Kuchma and his henchmen were going to clear them out. People were camped in overnight. People in Ukraine believe very strongly about freedom and liberty, and I stand with them in that. But what's happened is the Ukrainians have been played. And so Russia, they're pawns in this attack on Russia. And the plan has always been pin Russia down in Ukraine, pivot, and then go after China. This is part of a larger effort by the United States to try to assert itself as the dominant military and economic force in the world. And guess what? It's not working. It's not going to work. It is doomed to failure. And the meeting that Russia has had with China, Putin and Xi meeting, has basically demonstrated that we've taken the wrong approach, and it is disastrous. It's separating us from the rest of the world community, and it won't be too long. Let's talk next 5 years. We could be on the outside looking in with the U.S. dollar starting to drop in its value, and the elasticity provides to the U.S. economy as the world, has moved away from the dollar. That elasticity is going to be lost, and we're going to find ourselves in a dramatically different role because of this neoconservative, maniacal thinking that somehow we're going to rule the world.
Right. I mean, and it fits into the binary construct that defines American conversations, American politics, American media. Everything has to be A versus B. Everything has to be red versus blue. And so we have this very simplistic Manichaean, as Congressman said, structure of how we talk about things, where a third way or a third option or not having to be on a side is really hard for people to even accept, for people to fathom, for people to get. And this is the way propaganda has always worked. And 20 years ago, if you were speaking out against the Iraq War,
Yep,
and
exactly.
How many times, Congressman, did you get called, an Al Qaeda sympathizer,
or
how many, right? You're Saddam, right? You're just giving out Saddam Ba'ath Party talking points,
right?
So this is to be expected. It is just the nature of how warfare works, how propaganda works. It has always been this way. Many people are probably very familiar with the famous Hermann Göring quote from the Nuremberg trials when he's asked about this, and he just says, "Oh, you just scare the people. You tell them that they're being threatened by an enemy, and you say if someone stands up and says no, we're not being threatened, you call them unpatriotic, and you shout them down, and this is how you get a war going." I'm paraphrasing. He was. Unfortunately, for a war criminal, much more eloquent than I am. But that's the reality here of why you see such a tainted, limited discussion about the war in Ukraine. I mean, as someone who speaks out against the war in Ukraine, the notion that why do I speak out against the war against Ukraine? Am I against the Ukrainians? No, absolutely not. I want to see the Ukrainians win. I want to see Russia removed to its borders. But I don't believe the right pathway going forward, a pathway that makes sense, a pathway that has any chance of success, is to continue this war, right? Sending more weapons, sending more money only prolongs a deep and awful stalemate that has strengthened Russia. And now Russia is in a much stronger position now than it was a year ago. And unfortunately, the Russians are now clearly saying they're not going to negotiate. Their spokesman Peskov just said that last week, reported in TASS. A military solution is what we believe in now. Up until February, that's not what they were saying, and it's because the United States and NATO and the Ukrainian leadership chose to win militarily in Ukraine, just as the United States did for how long in Iraq. We're going to win militarily. In Afghanistan, we did this. One of the reasons I resigned in Afghanistan in 2009 is because we won't negotiate with the Taliban, even though the Taliban are coming in and trying to negotiate with us. I had 2 occasions where that happens. And nope, deny it, say it didn't happen. We're going to win militarily. Well, when you do that and you spurn efforts of negotiation, say as we saw in Ukraine in the beginning of that invasion last year, where you have reports from the Israelis, the Turks, from American officials, from the Ukrainians themselves, that there were negotiations occurring. We know there were negotiations occurring, and the Ukrainians pulled out. Well, when you spurn the other side and you say, no, we're going to win this militarily. Well, when you don't, this is what defeat looks like. And that's what happened to the Americans in Afghanistan. That's what happened, in a lot of these wars. But this idea that somehow there's only 2 ways about it, one side or the other, is, there's a bunch of reasons for it, but it's very, very destructive because you can't have these conversations until it's too late.
Well, if I may add, Katie, it's okay.
Of course.
I think it's important to watch China's moves here. because China is making overtures of trying to create a plan for peace in Ukraine. The U.S. doesn't like that. I understand that, because the U.S. has no interest in ending that war. They're ready to fight, as has been said over and over, to the last Ukrainian. And what a tragedy visited upon the brave, the heroic people of Ukraine and their families. And when you see, I mean, there's such a lack of decency and compassion here. And I want to reflect that back to 20 years ago. What hit me over and over and over, day in and day out, as I understood the suffering of families who lost somebody in 9/11, I understood the suffering of the families in Iraq who were losing family members, children were losing parents, whole families wiped out in bombings. And if you have any sense of human decency or humanity, if you care at all for just what the poet called, if you have any primal human sympathy at all, how can you just say, yeah, it happened, and we move on to the next thing? This is crying out for justice, what happened. And if we fail to address this, then we make even easier an intensification of war with Russia and a real war with China that will at some point go nuclear. So This is why it's so important to talk about Iraq. We have not yet redeemed and sanctified the memories of the people who were killed there, 1 million people. And when I would bring it up in Congress, it was like in politics to talk about dead Iraqis. What? Are they not human beings? Do they not have the same flesh and blood that we do? I mean, the human genome theory said that we're 99.99% made of the same thing. And yet somehow we evoked an outgroup, an enemy, and in the construction of that enemy, we dehumanized the people. And in effect, we dehumanized ourselves.